Okay, so to start, it would be good to understand local and regional clouds. I suspect they're not quite as complicated to define as the edge, but it'd be good for you to give us some description as your understanding, or what do you think, a local or regional cloud, what are the characteristics of them?
Yeah, I think I try always to use the same example, right? If you have public cloud and regional clouds, I think to me the difference is having retailers like supermarkets in your city, in your town, versus a wholesale provider to those supermarkets. So somewhere the supermarket needs to go and buy their stock. And to me, these regional clouds are not necessarily linked to the public cloud, but I look at them as little retail outlets that are in a town, in a city, and provide local services and local products to the citizens in that region.
Okay, and does that mean therefore that they are provided by local companies, or can hyperscalers provide regional and local clouds, or is that not correct?
I think, with the hyperscalers right now, if they would do that as well, we would have like this perfect infrastructure monopoly. So really the regional clouds are a bit of an antithesis to that, which is to really have them run by local IT shops, provide local service, really tailored to what the companies in the region need, what the citizens in the region need, what the government in the region needs. And really, there's so many buzzwords going around, like sovereignty and sustainability and integration into the local energy grid. And I think ultimately that requires regional and local infrastructure. It all should, let's say, be compatible with each other. But it's ultimately something that local IT shops provide as a service to the city.
Okay, and the next question was going to be, what are the benefits? And I think you've outlined some of them there, obviously, for tailoring services, but are there any other, or do you just want to sort of characterize exactly what the benefits are of the sort of local regional approach?
I think looking at the word sustainability, we can take those three bubbles, the economic benefits, societal, and environmental. Sorry. From an economic perspective, it adds local GDP. So you have a regional cloud that earns money from the company, citizens, and government in that region. That company that runs that regional cloud probably pays taxes in that region and creates jobs in that region. So from an economic perspective, it's very donut economy. It's very local. I think from an environmental perspective, there's then also a bigger incentive to, if there's a data center or hardware, to source that locally, to integrate it into the local, let's say, energy system. In Germany, there's a few examples of smaller data centers heating swimming pools across the street, municipal swimming pools, which is great, right? And then from a societal perspective, again, it creates local jobs, but it also means that the IT services that I use have service in my language. There's maybe even my neighbor might be working at the regional cloud, and I can ask them some silly questions. And it becomes something that's less threatening, coming from the internet very far away, and more, hey, this is like a bakery now. And I think those three bubbles, you have benefits across all of them, and that's why I'm a big fan of this concept of regional clouds.
Okay, and I must ask, are there any downsides to the benefits you've explained, but are there any negatives to local regional clouds?
As an engineer, a little bit, a software engineer, there's of course the problem of scale. So you won't get scale that easily. So I think from a cost perspective, I think it might not be super competitive. I think the second problem is that you have the risk of a lack of compatibility. So if you want to move from one region to another, you have to ensure that it's compatible so that IT can really move. And the third piece is probably you get a lot of underutilized infrastructure, because you might build this data center, but it's only half full because the city doesn't need that much. So there needs to be maybe some kind of trading going on between the different regions, which I think is a downside, but also an opportunity.
And in terms of sort of where local regional clouds fit, a lot of people are taking a multi-cloud approach, or hybrid cloud is what everyone's supposedly working towards. So how do you see them fitting? Presumably, it depends slightly. If you are just a local company, I guess you can potentially just use a local cloud. But if you're a sort of multinational, where do regional locals fit into your sort of overall cloud strategy?
I think global companies, if you really look at who is moving to the cloud the quickest, the public cloud, or the hyperscale cloud, it is global companies that need this global footprint, right? Also, if you look at big tech companies, they want to be global very quickly, and it makes sense to build on this mega infrastructure that's available for that. I think you do need to think about your IT infrastructure differently if you're a global company and you want to benefit from this regional plus hyperscale principle. You need to have your, let's say, your global workloads inside inside the hyperscale clouds where they are accessible everywhere with low latency. And then you need to really bring certain workloads to the local level, let's say near your office or near your production facility, which then sounds a lot like edge again. But edge is always, it's like the tentacles of a very large worm, or a large, I don't know, good animal to use that.
Octopus, maybe, I don't know.
Octopus, exactly, yeah. It's like the tentacles of a very large octopus going even further closer to you, right? But rather what I mean is that there is a symbiosis between people who run regional clouds, so giving local IT service providers also an opportunity to compete, and then having a larger company providing this global network, this global platform, and not having it all come from the same company. So it becomes more of a symbiosis rather than an octopus going everywhere all the way to the edge with its tentacles.
Okay, and in terms of the sustainability, I mean, you mentioned a bit earlier, but I'm thinking in terms of local, regional, is it just as simple that the data, everything doesn't have to travel as far, so you're not using as much energy, whereas if your data center's in another continent, for example, just the the amount of energy required to transfer data or use applications is just that much more than if it's whether it's in your town or your region. Is it as simple as that, or are there other sort of sustainability angles?
I think there's many. So I think there's this aspect of data movement. I think that's often a bit overrated in that sense. I think there's a huge piece is also sourcing. Like if you have companies in a region and they all have like a few racks in their office, what the co-location companies have been trying to do is always move those racks also into their co-location facilities. And I think if you have a local IT provider who turns that hardware into cloud, I think that could be very attractive to a lot of companies. Like you give us your hardware and we'll give you, let's sort of say, on-demand cloud capacity back. I think that's really interesting, and basically reuses the hardware. And I think there's just a lot more social pressure and incentive for a local company to also contribute to the local environment, let's say using heat recovery or by building a data center that really fits nicely into the surroundings or has a green roof or something like this. I think there's just more, if a global real estate company comes to your town and builds a data center, not saying they don't care about the citizen, but they don't know anybody there. So there's no social pressure, no connection. And I think whenever we look at regional IT firms, they really give back to the community. And I think that's the kind of that's the neighbor we want. Is that digitalization is not something that comes from London to Manchester and is pushed down from London all the way by these smart people into Manchester, but you want Manchester to have digitalization as a neighbor. So people feel good about it and feel like it's part of their city, and part of their friends are working there, and it's a lot of, I think the social aspects shouldn't be underestimated.
And in terms of all types of clouds, how easy is it to sort of calculate or get a reasonable handle on the carbon footprint? Because I mean, everyone's driving towards sustainability, and theoretically it's fairly easy, for your own infrastructure to understand, what's involved, and even your supply chain. But when it goes to the cloud, we hear of, again, the hyperscalers doing marvelous things with, solar power, etc. But fundamentally, is it at all possible to drill down and find out, or do you just have to trust that, if your cloud provider says, yes, I do this, this, and this, is there any way of checking that, or you just have to take them at face value?
That's a good question. I think we all would benefit from some more transparency. But to give a more technical answer, I think at the scale that the big cloud providers are currently operating these data centers and infrastructure, I think it's very difficult to pinpoint where is the application where's my workload, and what's the footprint of that specific workload, right? Because a lot of the magic is about moving things around very quickly that you don't, as the operator, you don't really know where things are anymore. And so that becomes very tricky. I think in a regional setting, that's a lot easier. And there's also a lot more incentive to be transparent. And I always, when we talk to regional operators, I always say, this is an opportunity to differentiate, right? If the cloud providers are having a hard time being transparent, and you are being transparent, and then there's these new laws coming in, like the CSRD in Europe, and then all these reporting requirements, then companies buying locally from you benefit from you being able to provide that carbon footprint data, which they need for their reporting. So there is a great opportunity to differentiate regional cloud on top of the regionality to just be the ones that are transparent.
Okay, and earlier on, I think you referenced data sovereignty briefly, but one of the major concerns, I guess, about the cloud is data sovereignty. And I mean, I try and study it with a sort of non-expert view, but it seems incredibly complicated and a bit like greenwashing with sustainability. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there with data sovereignty, you know, saying people, oh, you can't, you know, let your data leave your building. I mean, that's a bit of exaggeration, but do you, and then, you know, there's potentially country, regional variations, different industries have different requirements. I mean, do you understand, are you able to give us a basics as to what is or isn't possible, or is it far too complicated depending on what industry you are and where in the world you might be based?
I think nothing is really, especially in tech, a lot of things are made to be more complicated, but I don't think that fundamentally that they're complicated. So before I say anything, I have to say that I'm always saying data doesn't matter. I'll explain you why. So let's talk about what is data, right? So you type something into your computer, and let's say you type it into Google Docs, right? Something that a lot of people have seen now. We type it into Google Docs. It basically means your typing is the data that gets transferred to a server somewhere and stored. And sometimes, let's say in the case of ChatGPT, because also something everybody knows, you type something, it gets sent to the server. That's data that goes to the server, and the server does something magical, processing of the data, and sends it back, right? And that's the data you get back. And that's data, right? And what does it sound like? That sounds a lot like a commodity that's used to transport information, right? So there's not a lot you can do with that, because in order for a computer to work, you need to send data there, it needs to process it, and you need to get it back. Now we can argue, where does the processing happen, right? It can happen in Europe, it can happen in the UK, it can happen in the US, and that's okay. We can have that conversation. What I think is really confusing, though, is that since I'm German, I get to say we Germans did. We Germans created this together with the French, like something like Gaia X, where then the thing is, let's create data ecosystems on top of also big hyperscale cloud providers, basically adding some kind of encryption and trust thing, so that I know when I send my data there, that it's really there. I know what they're doing with it, and that it never left Germany, which again, might solve a problem for certain people. But, and here's the big thing with sovereignty, if 80% of all the data centers and all the facilities in Europe are owned by foreign companies, how can you then claim that you are sovereign? Right? It's like arguing about electrons. Oh, we got to make sure that all the electrons flow only in the UK. And then, you have, I don't know, the Norwegians build you a power grid and they own your power grid. And then one day they don't like you anymore. They turn it off and the UK has no power. Nobody would call that sovereign. And data doesn't give us sovereignty. It's the infrastructure that gives us sovereignty. If you own the fiber, if you own the data centers, if you own the computers, that's then sovereign, right? And I think there is a very large interest not to talk about that infrastructure. It's a lot easier to talk about the data and, like, we got to, privacy and stuff. And I'm not saying it's not important, but you cannot have sovereign digital infrastructure in the UK if the UK government runs on a US-based cloud. Doesn't matter how you argue, it never works.
Yeah, that's interesting, because my next question was going to be, bearing in mind that pandemic and since that, all the geopolitical sort of issues with supply chains, people are re-examining their, if you like, their physical supply chains. So if I've understood you correctly, you're suggesting that maybe virtual or cloud supply chains people need to be understanding, as you say, because it's all well and good to have it, but if the cloud is somewhere else or owned, as you say, by a potentially, well, I would say threat, but we can't imagine anyone. But as the world has shown us in the last few years, today's friends might be tomorrow's problem or whatever. You say that's really what needs to be, as opposed to any regulations to do with where data needs to reside, etc. That the more important thing is trying to be as sure as you can that your infrastructure is as safe as possible, whether it's wherever that might be.
I think it only matters if you really want to be sovereign. I don't think that it's necessary that we are so like hardcore, sovereign. Like putting the internet into a box is very difficult because it's already global by design. If you think about it, most of the internet exchanges are non-profits, right? There's a lot of the internet is already a very special place. I think though, we need to be like owning a power grid in a country is fantastic, right? You have all the power, you make a lot of money because you have a monopoly. And I think there's a very similar path that the cloud infrastructure that we see today is on, right? Is to create this layer that you have computation available, unlimited computation, unlimited data. It's just available. It's like plugging something into the wall and you have electricity, right? And of course, if I were a company, I would love to be the company that owns all that infrastructure. And I think what we see today is 3-4 companies really competing to be the infrastructure of the future. And there I would be a bit worried as a government and be like, how come none of these companies come from Europe? And I think in a way, the Data Act in the EU and all these data privacy things, they are meant to constrain the power of the tech companies, but they are coming from a lack of, and I'm sorry, dear politicians, but they're coming from a lack of understanding of how this actually works, right? If you really let's take Microsoft, you have a cash flow machine called licensing, right? Windows licenses, Office licenses, software licenses. You take that cash flow machine and you say, oh, what can we do with all this cash? We have like they have more cash right now than Shell does. To just give you like 40 billion versus 60 billion free cash flow. And then they say, oh, let's build some infrastructure. Okay, so they build all these data centers, they buy all these servers, and they have so much cash that they don't even need to take out debt for that, right? And then they strap a massive sales force on top and say, so who's buying compute, right? And they're willing to give 80-90% discounts on that, on the cost of that, because they know once you're on it, you're never going to leave. And it's literally like an electricity company building a power plant in your city and then walking around and saying, who would like some electricity? Right? And the cable is free. Don't worry. We'll pull the cable to your house. It's no problem. Because once your house is connected, you'll be a consumer forever. And I think we ought to talk a little bit more about that in the context of sovereignty. If the goal is sovereignty, I'm not saying it is. For me, it's not. But if the goal is sovereignty, we ought to talk about them building our infrastructure of our digital future.
Okay, so I mean, as you say, a lot of companies get hung up on the where their data is. I'm guessing in a lot of cases it's sort of more protection, because if anything goes wrong, and then somebody suddenly says, "Well, hang about, I'm in Germany, but you're telling my data was in Singapore and it got hacked. Why did that happen?" So it's almost like a safety first measure. But at the moment, that same customer potentially wouldn't say, "Well, hang about, you're using if something went horribly wrong, they said, well, why are you using this infrastructure or that infrastructure?" But that's what really, that is as you say, the main question needs to be not really where your data resides, but if you like, the transport that gets it there, or you can get it back from. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I think most of what we do today, if you store data in a place, even in big clouds, it's encrypted. So even the cloud providers cannot look at the data. So I think that problem has been solved a long time ago. You don't store passwords, plain text in a database, right? You encrypt the password in a way that it can only be decrypted if somebody types in their password. Like this is this again. It's if you don't understand how, if you never build software, especially modern software, then it's very difficult to understand that there's a lot of things already in place to make sure that data is essentially untouchable. And there's cryptographers that have been working very hard on making sure that storage is encrypted, that you have a special key, and that key is on your keychain, and you have to plug it in. Like, there's already a lot put in place. I think what might help is if there were more transparency on what companies are doing to protect your data, right? Like, how do they actually encrypt it, and to be a bit more explanatory about it. And then there's this other thing, which is also creating even more confusion, is the data that advertisers, for example, collect about you, right? Tracking, right? And that's all thrown into this pot of talking about data, right? Then all of a sudden, Instagram is collecting data about us. That's not good. So we've got to regulate that. Companies are afraid that their data is getting stolen in Singapore. And it's all like data, 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 data. This is not the same thing, huh? Because being tracked on the internet is something that you are not aware of, and you don't do it voluntarily. And it's used in a way that you have not agreed to, like profiling, and that's a different problem than a corporate putting their HR data in Singapore. And we ought to talk about these things as separate things, and not just be like data, privacy, sovereignty, data protection. It creates massive confusion, I think, in society.
But you suggest, because I know in the UK, I think in the papers this week, they were suggesting that the government's had a modelling exercise with the semiconductor problem, that if like there were no chips, basically coming into the UK, and what would happen to the country, a bit of a sort of disaster. So, but they almost need to be doing that. You're saying if as you say, the hyperscalers for whatever reason all decide they're not going to supply their services into the UK, you almost need a model for that scenario as well, or any country needs to understand its resilience to do with that.
That's what they're debating now in Europe, right? Like building chip factories. And I'm like, aha, finally somebody realized that no chip is made in Europe, no server is made in Europe, the data centers are not owned by European companies, and then we're shouting sovereignty all day long, right? And I'm glad that people are waking up to it, but on the flip side, you really then have to look at it holistically. For example, chips, right? Especially the next generation, 4 nanometers, 3 nanometers. There's one company on this planet that makes the machines for them. That's in the Netherlands. There's one company that makes the lenses for that machine, which is in Germany. Like, it's not that we are not part of the value chain. It's just that the end manufacturing, the assembly, does not happen in Europe. And why is that so? Because we want it to be cheap, right? And if you want the laptop for 300 pounds, right, in a supermarket, that's not going to work if it's been assembled in a UK factory, on UK soil. It's just, from a labor cost perspective, it doesn't work. And that's, of course, you can say like, oh, why is it all manufactured there? But it's there because we want it cheap.
But I suppose on the positive side, with that example, I mean, the Dutch company, one assumes that they will never sort of turn their back on the Western world, and they are important. So therefore, there's a certain amount of leverage, if you like, with if all the manufacturing is basically happening in the Far East, but they do need these machines. So there's a sort of, and is that a similar, on a positive side with all the the hyperscalers, that there's a sort of two-way through. They don't own everything, and therefore they have to be somewhat sort of negotiate. They can't just say that, because it'll backfire on themselves. I know it's a complicated issue, but so it's perhaps not quite as gloomy as we might think. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's definitely not gloomy. We as a society, none of this is a problem until we say it is, right? So we can also run on one global infrastructure platform. If we all agree that that's what we want, that's also fine. I think the danger that we're running into now, especially let's take this example of this Dutch company, ASML, right? Where then the US orders the Netherlands and ASML to not sell those machines to China, right? And all of a sudden, the company is not a company anymore, it's a moral actor. And I think that's also something we need to talk about. I'm not saying it's bad, it's just companies are there to compete to maximize profits, right? They're not supposed to stop climate change. They're not the saviors of the planet. They're supposed to compete. And okay, ASML has a monopoly. That's not good. But then maybe we should talk about why do we allow this, like only one company making all these chips? We need to have that conversation. I think when it comes to the hyperscalers, it's the same. Like there is a certain amount of competition between AWS, Google, and Microsoft, and then from China there's Alibaba. There's no real competition from Europe, and that's something we can say that's bad, or we can just accept it. I think in the digital world, what's so dangerous is that the cloud providers are not cloud providers. The cloud providers are vertically integrated tech companies. AWS is a fraction of the size of Amazon, right? Google Cloud is a fraction of the size of Google's business. And I think what we need to say is, can these companies own the infrastructure that makes also their product impossible to compete with? Let's take your, just to make it really plastic, data, right? What you just mentioned, data. Data is the new gold. Okay, that's what everybody's shouting. If data is the new gold, the new oil, sorry, not gold, the data is the new oil, then my first question is, who owns the biggest refinery, right? And then, because these three companies have been able to use their cash flow to build bigger and bigger cloud platforms, and then they sell it to other enterprises. So you have infrastructure that's paid for by people, by companies worldwide. That is so big that with a switch of a button, you can just kick out all the customers and say, we now have the world's largest refinery, and we're just refining for ourselves. No, not for clients anymore. And that's an incredible amount of power. Plus, if you have something like ChatGPT, it enables Microsoft to train these massive models, or Google as well, on their infrastructure that nobody can compete with, because nobody has infrastructure of that size. And I think that again then creates a competitive advantage for their search business or for their phone business. And that's something I think can be, it creates a reinforcing mega vertical monopoly. And I think that's something we need to talk about. Sorry, that was very long.
No, it's fascinating. And just to sort of bring this down, I believe I presume you'll be talking about this and other topics. You've got an event happening in the middle of March in Germany. So is it, what sort of topics? Is it what we've been discussing, or what wider issues? What's going on in that?
It is really, thanks for asking. The event in Germany is really a first experiment to say, because we've seen a lot of events where the big hyperscalers are going to a town and they say, look, if you help us build a data center here, we create jobs, we create taxes, we create digitalization, millions of jobs will come to your city. And let's face it, anybody who works in the data center industry knows that there's not a million people working in the data center, and also it doesn't create necessarily that many jobs around it. Maybe for a short time, but not a long term. And this event is really to say, like, okay, if the government is incentivizing these big companies to come here, why doesn't the government also support the regional actors that are already there, right? The IT service companies that are there. And this is really an event to bring together these regional IT providers and say, dear government, why don't you support us to compete with them rather than supporting them to basically take our market? And that's something that I think we see a lot of people starting to want to, ask government, like, hey, can you please create a level playing field? Because I can't compete with Microsoft's cloud. I just can't.
Okay, and we've covered quite a lot of ground, but in terms of bringing it all together, what does, yes, obviously you've got this event and potentially rolling them out, but do you have other projects or work you're going to start around this sort of area? What do you think you are able to do? Because as you say, you're up against some sort of formidable size of organization. But then again, as you say, with using the semiconductor industry example, that the EU's going, I think the Chip Act or whatever it is, by 2030, they're going to work things out. So are you advocating some kind of, I know poor old UK might be sat on the sidelines because obviously we're no longer in the EU, but are you advocating some kind of European strategy for the cloud? Is that your sort of end goal, to try and get something sensible sorted for that?
I think a lot of it boils down to understanding. So a lot of what we talked about, these models of how I explain things, is something that we do a lot with politicians in the EU, but also on a country level, to first of all understand, the infrastructure, the business model, and then what does data do in that context, so that there is better lawmaking is very easily attained if they understand what they need to regulate, right? And so we work a lot on that. We also see, and you hear me talk about it all day, every day, transparency as a means to compete. We think that a lot of European and UK actors actually outperform cloud providers on environmental metrics. They are more efficient, they use refurbished hardware, they use refurbished buildings. But if you look at the product level, you see virtual machines or servers, right? They all look the same. And for us, we really push the EU to say, create a competitive advantage for regional or national cloud actors that outperform on the environmental side, because that's the kind of competition we want. And that's where European and British companies can really win and outperform. And I can show you data. It's really true that we are better. We are better at running more efficient hosting and infrastructure as a service offerings. We are better. So why shouldn't we compete on that? That's the second one. And the third one is really to say, to think about what are the enabling forces. For example, a lot of hosting companies and cloud providers are struggling with buying hardware at risk. So the problem with building hosting companies, before you can have a customer, you have to have a working infrastructure. But to have a working infrastructure, you need to spend 5-10 million pounds in hardware that's basically at risk. And no bank will really finance that, because nobody finances really servers. It's not interesting. It depreciates after 5 years. And so thinking about how can the government, for example, support loan making in that sense, or support with other financing conditions for enabling these companies to buy hardware at risk and then build a business on top of that. Because again, otherwise they can't compete. And so we think a lot about really, like I always say, crowbars. Like where can we do something, or AWS hands out these $100,000 credits to startups? Can we just forbid them, right? And there's these things that I think would really turn the competition upside down, and those are the points we focus on.
Okay, well, it's been great to chat, Max, and as I say, covered a lot of ground, some brilliant insights. So as ever, appreciate your time, and I hope the event goes well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Phil.